So anyway, I would like you to welcome Dana Chisnell.
Thank you, Joe. So this was a completely typical usability test. It had all the features that you would expect. We'd rented a lab in a town called Waltham, Massachusetts, just outside Boston. And it looked exactly like you would expect, right? One large room that's sort of multi-purpose, where the participant and I were, and one tiny room where my client and the team were crammed in with a piece of glass between. I never know whether it's one way or two way, and Jared always corrects me no matter what I say. So this was a fairly large study. We were going to have 15 participants, and we were midway through testing a thing that is basically a retirement calculator. Couldn't be more mundane, right? My client, an insurance company, trying to sell annuities, wanted to make things awesome for their customers by helping them plan for retirement. And the way this thing works is that instead of the usual retirement calculator where you start punching in numbers about what kind of money you have and what sort of assets you have, it starts by presenting the screen that makes you the boss of your future. You are now the CEO of your retirement. And people kind of loved this. It was really interesting, a very different approach. But the next couple of steps had more to do with how you pre-visualized your future. What kind of goals did you have? Things like learning a new language or starting a new business, traveling, downsizing your house. I don't know why this would be a dream exactly, but maybe some people think it is. And we were about halfway through this study. I think Shelley was our 7th participant out of 15, and it was late in the afternoon in the middle of the winter, and everybody was kind of tired, and so we were hoping that something interesting would happen, and it did. What happened was when Shelley got to the part where you pick all these options for your future, she picked a few things, nothing unusual there. But then I heard an audible sob. And this is only the second time in my career when somebody's cried in a usability test. And this was not because of the UI. What had happened was she saw among the choices an option to take care of your aging parents. And it struck her that she would not get this opportunity with her mother because her mother had ALS and was going to die in just a few months. And the weight of this just poured right out there in the usability test. So we stopped, and I got her a glass of water, and we chatted for a minute, turned off the cameras and everything. And I said, so tell me about what's going on. This is how she told me the story of what was happening. And I said, so what do you want to do? We could stop here. You're under absolutely no obligation to keep going. This is the part that we come back to in the introduction to usability test that says, you can stop at any time. I've hardly ever had to do that. And wanted to give that option to Shelley. She said, no, I'll keep going, because I need to start thinking about this. And I haven't really done it before because really this life stuff, I always sit down and do with my dad. And I said, well, here's my cell phone. We could call your dad if you wanted to. And she said, no. He's at work, and I can't really interrupt him right now. And so that moment struck me. Here I am testing this completely mundane thing in a totally ordinary usability test. But this thing, this totally ordinary mundane thing, is actually part of the social web. that there are lots of relationships and dependencies going on here because of the context of the interactivity. And so, looking at usability testing this way, thinking about usability testing, where you have one person, one computer, one task, this is really not working that well anymore. And so I want to talk about that. Now, this method, usability testing, this has been around for a really long time. I did my first one in 1983. It's borrowed from clinical psych, not a bad idea, but it really failed Shelley that day, and it failed my team too, my client. So I started thinking about this. I had started thinking about this problem, this idea, a few months before this, actually, when Google launched Buzz. Buzz was a social networking system, and the idea was that if you were a Gmail user, it automatically signed up all the people who you frequently corresponded with to be in your network as soon as you said, yes, I'm going to be in Buzz. On the outside, this seems like a phenomenally awesome idea. Instant network. But, and here's a big but, what if some of your most frequent correspondents are actually people who you would rather not ever see or correspond with ever again? There's a famous story, a woman named Harriet, immediately the next day after Buzz rolled out, blogged about her story. And her story was that now, suddenly, her ex-husband and her 10-year-old were connected through this network. And her ex-husband was not just her ex-husband, but he was under a restraining order to stay away from their kid. And she was pissed. Now, this is a really interesting set of problems. This is a really interesting scenario to me, because what happened after that was that the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, investigated Google and its privacy policies and discovered that Google was violating its own privacy policies by doing this. It fined them a lot of money, subjected them to 20 years worth of audits, and now fines them something like $16,000 for every individual infraction that is discovered. Now, Facebook recently went through this too. They kept it kind of quiet, but they were investigated as well, ended up paying fees and fines, and are subject to audits. Twitter as well. Now, what does this have to do with usability testing? Well, what it has to do with usability testing is this method that we have of bringing in an individual into a lab and watching them interact with something, writing down little problems and go fixing the little problems, is not telling us what we need to know for the social web. After I blogged about Buzz and the implications and the real life episodes of people, and how it is possible that there is some kind of research methodology out there that you could do to have revealed this problem, I heard from a whole bunch of interesting people. One was, in the media, there was a lot of coverage about how Google had used Buzz internally for about a year. So 20,000 Googlers used Buzz every day for a year. This sounds pretty good for a test, but it's inside the garden walls, and everybody there is invested in making this great, right? Everybody has drunk the Kool-Aid that this is an awesome tool. So that's one thing. And then I got this email from somebody who had been in the user research and usability testing staff at Google at the time that Buzz was being developed. And she asked me not to use her name, but she told me that there had actually been usability testing done, and that it did happen in a lab, and it was one person, one computer, with a limited prototype with bogus data. And we do this all the time. I've done this dozens of times. This is a completely acceptable way to test all kinds of stuff. But if you don't know who the other people are in the relationships that you're being connected to, using bogus data, using fake emails or messages or whatever, how do you know how that's going to be in the real life? So, the techniques that we're using can really only tell us about what we know how to look for. And usability testing is awesome, absolutely awesome, for identifying frustration points, right? Where are people going to get stuck? Where are there obstacles in the interaction design and the flow of a task? But we're really, really, really not sure how to do user research that will tell us what we need to know about relationships online. And there's something wrong, and I think it's this. People simply don't operate in real life the way they do in usability tests, the way we ask them to behave in usability tests. Now, I'm as guilty of this as anybody. I did a couple of usability tests for WebEx when they were developing their new version. We had one person, one computer, me, the moderator, setting up meetings and closing up meetings and doing all the weird stuff that WebEx had in mind at the time. And did we actually have any meetings? No, we didn't have any meetings at all. One of my other clients is Marriott.com. Something like 80% of all revenue that comes through Marriott comes through their website. So they do a ton of usability testing. They test everything, every minute, tiny thing. The thing is, before I did a study for them that looked at the whole experience from the time the person decides to take a trip to the time they click submit on the credit card screen, nobody had ever gone through that whole thing before. And one of the things that revealed was that there are a lot of people involved in the decisions around planning a trip and booking a hotel room. Might not seem obvious on the surface, but if it's a business trip, you have all kinds of dependencies about who's paying for it, how does it get paid for, are there constraints on how much it can cost, where's the event that you're going to? And all of these questions have to be answered by other people. Also, determining when you're going to check in, when you're going to check out. Do you have commitments with family, friends, meetings with clients, things like that? If this is a pleasure trip and you're taking your family, the main thing you want to know is there a pool? So that's about the family. That's about the relationship. But there was only one person in the room doing the usability testing. To go back to the retirement calculator example, again, we had one person in the room testing this thing. Invariably, though, they talked about the other people who were important to the decisions that they would make about what they were going to be doing in retirement and where the money came from. So, for example, most of the guys who were in the study wished that their wives were there because the women in the family controlled and managed the finances. These guys didn't actually know what the mortgage payment was. And the women in the study wanted their kids to be available to have a conversation about what was going to happen for long-term health care. Who was going to be making those decisions, and how were those going to get made? These are really individual, sort of totally normal commercial things, but when you look up a little bit, think about the Arab Spring. Little resistance groups were using Facebook and eHarmony and other dating sites to organize resistance to the powers that be. Undercover. Who would ever have imagined that a social network would be used that way? And how do you test for that? So we are all taught, when you go to usability school, at places like UW, that this is about human-computer interaction. That it all comes down to this moment when somebody touches a screen or touches a keyboard. But more and more, this is really about human-to-human interaction that is mediated by technology. Now, the technology might be explicit, it might be ambient, like everybody here has a phone. You don't think of this as technology. And what's a computer? I just did this field study with a bunch of people who had recently retired. So lots of them are older. And one of these lovely, lovely people who I met with, she's 67 years old, she described herself as completely computer illiterate. She'd been a teacher for 40 years. She said, I am totally computer illiterate. I couldn't possibly go get another job right now because I would have no idea what to do with an Excel spreadsheet. But she had an iPad that she kept with her all the time, that she used all the time to send email, to go to Facebook, to check up on what her grandchildren were doing, to play casual games with other people over the internet. But to her, this shiny, lovely iPad, this was not a computer. So when we're thinking about these things, what are we really thinking about? Now, the methods for doing usability testing and user research probably were never perfect. They were probably just enough to do what we were doing, especially when I started. A lot of the work that we were doing was automating manual processes. We were not doing the kind of subtle things, the nuanced things that we're doing now. We were just sort of ham-fisting scheduling into an online calendar on a terminal. And guess what? Calendars are really not that different from how they were 40 years ago. But lots and lots of things are. And still we're using the same techniques. Now, computers or technology are everywhere. And so when you start to think about the social aspects of this, of designing for social interaction design, this really magnifies the imperfections of our research methods. And so it seems like when you start to look at how ambient technology is, everything has changed, but it actually hasn't. All this has happened before, all this will happen again. Technology does us the favor of offering us cycles. And so we're at the point in one of those when a lot of conventions are being established, like Luke talked about touch interfaces. What's going to end up happening out of that? Will there be de facto standards about how you swipe and flick and do other things? Probably. It's really exciting. It's really exciting to be designing right now. But it's also confusing and baffling. And it's really hard to do this design. So there are these 5 factors that I've come up with that I'm pretty convinced that we should consider in reworking and rethinking how we're doing user research and usability testing to avoid things like buzz privacy violations and some of the other examples that we have seen. First, in my definition of social, anything anyone does that affects the behavior of someone else is social. And so I want you to think right now, think really hard if you can do anything online that's not social. Now, usually when I ask this question, somebody goes, porn is not social. But it is. because you are actually changing your behavior and probably affecting the behaviors of other people in some way or other. We can talk about that after this if you want. The nature of the web is that it is social. The whole point of creating the web was to exchange messages and make information available to other people. That is social. Email is ridiculously social. Everything we do that affects the behavior of somebody else is social. Now, when you stop talking about human-computer interaction, one person, one computer, and start thinking about everything being social, instantly the picture grows, right? We're talking about scale, but larger sample sizes are not going to tell you everything you need to know. The Google example is an excellent one, I think, right? 20,000 people, this is a huge sample. There should have been boatloads of data about how this thing worked for them, or didn't. And there probably was, but it didn't reveal the privacy problem. And now we have some theories about why that happened. So you have to beware large sample sizes. And you can look at your user base as your sample size. It's going to be pretty common practice to just put things out there and see what happens. This is not necessarily bad, but even if you have a beta, you have a biased sample, so it has to be the right sample. Looking at scale a different way, if you think about websites like Quora, where on Quora you can ask questions of anyone and anyone can answer your questions, this is massively user-generated information architecture, massively user-generated content, and so how do you design for that? How do you test for that to make sure nobody gets lost in the serendipity? How do you do user research that will tell you how that's going to turn out? And how much are you willing to deal with the fallout of making changes if you just roll something out without doing much testing? Number 3, and this is probably my favorite one, because what I'm going to say is a little radical. The centerpiece of doing a usability test is giving the person a task scenario. And these come from lots of different sources. Often we believe that they are based on data because we may have done ethnographic research or other kinds of field research or gathered user stories in some other way. But often, we set up these scenarios in a usability test and we're actually asking people to pretend, because we've made this scenario way too generic for what's going on. So we use tasks in this method, in this set of methods, but users don't actually come to technology with tasks in mind. They don't say, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to make a tweet, and then my next task is to press the submit button. They don't do that. This is just not how normal people, go about things. And so what they are doing is really ephemeral, right? It's changeable. It depends on context and timing and what just happened and what they expect to happen next. And so my theory is that tasks are probably more like activities, where the goals emerge and they change depending on what the context is and what the timing is and who else is in the room and what else is on the screen, how fast the bandwidth is, what the gestures are, what the interface is like. And so we have reliably used, for a really long time, the ISO measures of efficiency, effectiveness, and satisfaction to measure usability. And I just don't think they apply anymore. What do those things mean when you have Facebook open all day? What is efficient about that? How do you know what effective actually means? And this actually gets me to satisfaction, which I'm pretty convinced is the wrong measure. Satisfaction is, I'm satisfied with this thing. It does what it says it was going to do. It's a promise kept, but there's no life there. The satisfaction is a problem. And so I think what we should be looking at instead is what does engagement mean? And how much control does the user have? Because that is what they want. Users want to be the boss of their data. But we're not letting them. And we've seen tons of examples of this. Buzz is one of those. Facebook, in its earlier days, had a feature called Beacon that you could post something that you had bought, or it would automatically pick up from other records things that you had bought and broadcast to the people in your friends network or your social graph what those things were and where you had bought them. This sounded like a really, really, really awesome idea, especially for Facebook's advertisers. Until a dude buys an engagement ring from Walmart and his fiance, his intended, sees this. That didn't work out too well. And pretty soon, there were more stories like this, and Facebook took the feature down. There are other kinds of episodes. There's this lovely website called Etsy where you can buy and sell handcrafted things. And there's some gorgeous stuff there. There's also some wacky stuff there. But one of the things Etsy decided to do about 1.5 years ago was to expose who the buyers were to each other and to the sellers. And so now your boss could conceivably go look you up on Etsy and see all the embarrassing things that you've bought there. Now, I hope my boss doesn't do that, but it could happen. So we need to take a really hard look at the conventional metrics that we're using. They are inadequate. And what does engagement really mean? I think this is way beyond anything that you're going to see in analytics. It's much more about what the inherent value is, what the value proposition is. And I think we are really not good at understanding that. Because as researchers, as designers, as developers, what we do is we take what the marketing group says is valuable and beneficial about the thing that we're working on, and we believe that. We sort of have to, and that's okay, but it hardly ever matches what consumers, users, think is valuable about the thing that they're using. And so what we need to know is what keeps people coming back. Why do they come back? What do they love about it? Why do they rely on what you've created? And if you took it away tomorrow, would they miss it? And why? Finally, out of my top 5, while users want to control their information, they also are hacking your UI all the time. Now, when I was growing up, trying to figure out how to do this kind of work, we were trained to think that when users did this kind of stuff, when they created workarounds for what was happening in the user interface to make it do what they wanted it to do, we were supposed to fix that by redesigning that thing so they didn't have to make the workaround. But we can't really keep up anymore. It's pretty much impossible. So just look at Twitter. Twitter was not designed with hashtags and direct messages and retweets. All of these came out socially, and they spread through the network, and pretty soon everybody started using them. And now all of the clients are designed with those things built in. Look at product reviews or restaurant reviews, especially if you go to the product reviews on Amazon. Some of them have turned into literary works. There's a little bit of competition going there. It's kind of fun. Somebody told me this great story about Flickr that in in the Arab Emirates that there was this big group of parents who wouldn't let their kids, especially girls, use social networks, especially things like Facebook. They did not want them to have a presence on the internet, but these girls figured out that they could use Flickr, that using Flickr was okay with the parents because they were posting photographs, not of themselves, but of things that they did and places that they went. And the girls figured out that they could embed notes to each other in the notes on the pictures, and their parents never figured it out. I think this is really clever and pretty funny, actually. So they created these workarounds. So now these kinds of individual workarounds surface to everybody in the network. You could use Flickr for critique, right? You could post your wireframes, for example, and invite people to make comments, and they could put them in place. That's kind of cool. And so etiquette and social norms, these adjust in these massive UIs over time and scale. And so design is effectively outsourced to the user community. That is what's happening here. Now, being online with all this ambient technology, this is about context and who's zooming who, basically, and we cannot violate the context of those relationships. Otherwise, we end up with problems. You know, clients find out embarrassing things about you. Girlfriend learns about the engagement ring. Not cool. And so lab testing and structured field visits, they're just really lacking when we try to understand where our designs fit into people's lives, into contexts, into relationships. And so something built for human-computer interaction doesn't cover the expanded view of this one person interacting online with all these different people and entities and relationships and the implications of that. And so I think what we need to do, what the next step is that we should be probably doing now, we might have needed to start a lot earlier, is start taking a look outside ourselves, outside psychology and computer science, to other disciplines, to other practices who have started looking at the space already. Right? Social sciences, decision sciences, communication sciences, linguistics. Because they have research techniques that we can borrow from. Borrow, combine. When I started thinking about this, I went and interviewed a whole bunch of smart people who were working in this area because I was grasping for what to do. And this is what they told me. The key is really combining methods, not being afraid to just whack together whatever works to answer the questions that you have and to see real behavior in real context. And so straight commodity testing is not going to tell you what you need to know. So here are some of the things that they came up with that they told me about that worked. Some of the stories about what didn't work are very funny, but we can talk about that some other time. So one of the things that was interesting was starting out usability tests or field sessions with getting people to walk you through the profiles for their social networks and explaining who their friends are, what the relationships are like, and why these people are in their networks, why they are connected, and do they put them in groups in their heads? Do they classify them in some way? Asking people how they met these people who are in their networks can be really enlightening. You know, when Facebook started, it was all about, who's having sex with who. So that was an answer that was obvious, but it's not like that necessarily anymore. I mean, the fastest it could be. But there are reasons that you added people to your network. How did you meet them? And why did you decide to say yes when they sent you a friend invitation? Game companies have been doing this for a long time, having multi-user tests where you bring a bunch of people into a room together to play a game, and often they are playing the game together. Sometimes they're playing the game with people who are outside the room, but this is a great way to see a dynamic that's happening in both digital space and meet space. So the idea here is that you invite 1 or 2 people who know each other and ask them to bring their friends. Makes recruiting easy. And because they know each other, the data, the results are much more relatable. A friend of mine did video diaries, basically reality TV, gave everybody video cameras and asked them to send all that video data into a particular server at the end of every day, then looked at all that video stuff, and then did follow-up interviews. Learned some really cool stuff. Also, there's this awesome technique called experience sampling. This was pioneered by Chisnell, who wrote the book Flow. He studied flow and all that behavior. He did it with pagers because that's what you had then. But the idea is that the researcher at random times during the day sends a message to the participants saying, where are you, what are you doing, who are you with, or whatever your questions are for the study. And the participant can send you a text message back or call you and have a brief conversation. You get in time, in context, data about what's going on. Very cool technique. Now, when you get good at these things, you can pull this off pretty quickly, but interaction unfolds over time. So doing a 1-hour session with somebody is not going to tell you everything that you need to know. Relationships unfold over time. So if you want to get anything like a snapshot of what's happening, this is not going to be something that you can necessarily do in a 2-hour standing session every week with your team. So doing this kind of research for social design is going to ask a lot more of you, of your team, and your participants. And because the investment is greater, the risks of getting valid data are also different from what we deal with in a typical kind of usability test or field study. And so you have to design the research really, really carefully. Now, I am not saying that we should not be doing usability testing. There's a lot to be learned from doing straight usability testing, but we should not stop there. And while I am a big fan of just putting stuff out there and seeing what happens, I'm pretty sure that that trend is going to end in a while when management starts to see, after a few more, violations of context and relationship and privacy, and it costs the organization money to do that, that they're going to ask you to start thinking about how to keep that bad stuff from happening. And so we'll have to be really clear and very sure of what the questions are that we're asking and why we're asking them and what we're going to do with the data, what we can reasonably do, ethically do with what we learn. And I think we'll have to understand better the ways and the reasons that humans collaborate and why they do stuff together in little groups and big groups, in tribes. And so I want to take you back to the lab in Waltham. Shelley is still, she's wiping her tears as she looks out at her future self. And we asked a business question. We asked, where are you with planning for your retirement? But the business might have been better served if we'd asked more about Shelley. Like, when you don't know the answer, who do you go to? Who gave you your best advice about money? What did you do about it? What's the right question? This is what we should be asking ourselves. If we had asked more about Shelley, starting out with, maybe who do you go to when you don't know, we might have learned some really useful things that would have expanded the audience for the tool and for extending the customer relationship over time and to other people. And we could have, maybe created a tool that more closely modeled and supported what people do in real life. And so, using methods that are a generation old, we really only know how to find things that we are looking for. I know, we're constrained by market pressure and we have this double bind because the market kicks back when we get it wrong. And so I think we need some new power tools. Right now, we don't have a lot of good ways of learning about things that we don't know about. Or maybe you do. Tell me. I want to hear about them. I think it's time to rework the old standards and work on some new remixes. So, thank you.